Okay, for number 17 from the 11 or the trig review, we are graphing y equals 1/2 sine pi of x plus 1. And so there are 3 parts of this that we have to consider. The first thing we need to consider is the period, so they can find the x scale we want. And so we remember that for a sine and cosine graph, the period is always 2 pi over b, where b is what is inside with the x. And so in this case, it's pi, and so our period turns out to be 2. And what we've talked about is our scale is best done by taking the period and dividing it into fourths, because there's these 4 parts to a sine or a cosine graph. And so we're going to say that our x scale is 1/2, which means that we've got 0, 1/2, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, so on and so forth as our x vertical x's. And then the y scale comes from what the min and the max is going to be. And so if we remember, this means that the amplitude is whatever that is. And so in this case, the amplitude is going to be 1/2. So it's going to go up 1/2. And so we're just going to make the y scale 1/2 as well. And so that you have, it looks like this. And then the last thing is this pushes the graph up 1, and so all the points up 1. And so instead of our midline being 0 like it normally is, our midline for this sine graph is going to be 1. And so that means since our amplitude is 1/2, we're going to go up 1/2 from that and down 1/2 from that 1. And so the min should have been 1/2 and the max should be 1.5. I think I've got those backwards on the answer sheet, so that might be where your confusion was. And our period did turn out to be 2. And so when we do the graph, we remember that the sine function starts because the sine of 0 equals 0. Our first point happens here. And then on that first quarter of the period, you go up to the max. And so it's going to go there and then back to 0 after half the period, right? Because the sine of 180 is also 0. And then back down and then here. And that's what our sine graph ends up looking like. And so we can just repeat it. The great thing about trig graphs is that they're periodic, and so they're just very repeatable. So your graph looks like this. Where our midline was y equals 1, our amplitude is 1/2, and so we go up 1/2 and down 1/2. And then our period was 2 because it's 2 pi over pi, which just equals 2. And so we needed a 1 full part of the graph to be every 2 units.